So you had a lot of concerns over what may occur last weekend. Do you have, Mayor, any concerns over any sort of protests or demonstrations this weekend?
The best information we have so far is that we don't have concerns for the coming weekend. Obviously, Seattle Police Department is working. We continue to work with community to really focus on how to protect First Amendment activities and make sure that protests remain peaceful. Last weekend, we saw a number of things. Number one, things had been escalating in Portland. People thought that federal forces were coming here. It was clear that Saturday people showed up and things escalated in part because of that. We also know that some people who participated in last Saturday's protest came to actually cause damage and to instigate and escalate conflict. And we are hoping that that isn't repeated this weekend.
There was a late Friday night court hearing. There's a court hearing again today over just the use of chemical weapons, blast balls, pepper spray, tear gas. You know that there's been a lot of background on this particular issue, but the Black Lives Matter organization is saying that the city should be held in contempt for using those crowd control measures. Where do you stand in all of this?
So the city responded to the motion for contempt, and I think they filed a number of things that show, and the judge agreed by delaying the hearing, that this is very complicated and that you cannot determine what the city is doing as a whole or the police department's doing as a whole based on very brief videos posted to Twitter. I want to make clear that any individual actions by police officers that were in violation of either Seattle Police Department policy or violated the judge's order, they will be held accountable. I talked to the Office of Police Accountability. They told me they had already received complaints and they themselves will be initiating some investigations. If it determines that that any person did violate the judge's order, Chief Best will hold them accountable. But when the department is held in, the issue is, did the department as a whole follow the judge's order? And the city, I think, filed very compelling pleadings showing that they did. There's now going to be a hearing on the facts so that we can hear not just based on isolated accounts, but really systemically, what was the police department facing? What actions did they take? And did they do what they needed to do to protect those who were protesting and exercising their First Amendment rights? And at the same time, protect from those who did come to have violence and destruction. And we saw that. There were a number of fires set, including one where there was residential apartments above a business. The East Precinct itself had an explosive device put in there that impacted one of the walls. So there was clearly some people in that crowd who had something other than peaceful protest on their minds.
Yeah, it's interesting to bring that up because the echo chambers in social media, they really seem to focus on the use of those chemical weapons, the pepper spray, the tear gas, but you don't see the same level of concern, it appears, to the destruction that occurred, especially in this last protest. You just mentioned there was an apartment complex with a bunch of people living in it that, according to reports, they had to evacuate. There were a couple of businesses that also reported windows getting smashed and getting in physical confrontations with some of the people that were demonstrating in the street. Yet there doesn't seem to be the same kind of outcry. Why is there not the same kind of outcry at City Hall over the damage that's been done to places where people live and work?
Look, we've got to make sure that we do protect everyone. And I think it's significant that there were damage done. And I believe we all should raise our voices against that, just as we raise our voices to protect those who are protesting for their First Amendment rights. Even the attacks on the East Precinct, we have to remember there's housing buildings right attached to those. And the fire chief has talked about how difficult it is to respond to some of these places. So I think we need to move to a place where we pull together as a city. We recognize that this is a very difficult time, and people should exercise their First Amendment rights and protest. It makes us better as a city. But we should also raise our voices collectively against those people who only want to cause damage, who do cause destruction, and who really jeopardize people's lives.
This all is part of the conversation with the phrase defund the police and changing the funding for the city. And I know you're part of those conversations. I don't know if you saw our King 5 poll this week, which was a statewide poll, but also included a poll of Seattleites over this particular issue. And there does seem to be a vast majority of people who do approve of moving some of the funds into mental health and counseling. 69% approved of that idea, but only 36 approved of the idea of defunding the police, and 50% opposed in the city of Seattle. What's your read on those numbers that we saw this week?
Chief Best and I were very clear. We believe we can reimagine policing and that we can build a system so that there is adequate mental health support and a number of things that community needs other than a police officer. But when people call 911, we want to be able to get them the help they need. Sometimes that will be a police officer and they need them immediately. Sometimes it will be a different kind of help. You can't just do a blunt cut for a percentage. You have to focus on what is it you need to do and build those resources. Right now in community, we do not have sufficient resources to provide those alternatives. But if you look at the model of Health One, which we started here in the city, I think it's a perfect example of people can call 911, and instead of a police officer coming, you have a trained medic and a social worker that can help someone. We have to build more of that. But again, you need a plan. You can't just do it overnight, and it's got to be based on what community needs.
Do you feel like there's any wiggle room with council, which is discussing this issue again today?
I'm very hopeful that the council actually will be looking on, not just on an arbitrary number, but what is it we want and need and how do we get there? I think that what I have heard from a number of people, and I would put myself in that, I think we can spend less on police. And we absolutely have to spend much more on building community health. And that is everything from access to affordable housing, to healthcare, to education justice. But we also need a police department that can respond to the emergencies that we have at all hours of the day in every part of the city. And so we don't want to jeopardize that through the cuts.
I can hear people in certain parts of the city who say, hey, they pay their taxes. They pay their taxes for schools, and they're not going to have school in session this fall in class. They pay their taxes for first responders, for police and fire, public safety. And there's talk that money may get cut from the police department, rerouted to housing. What do you say to people who want to have a police force and maintain the level of services?
We need a police force, and we don't want to erode the level of services. When people call 911, they expect police to show up quickly because if it's an emergency, and council is refusing to recognize that. I think one of the most difficult things or irresponsible parts about this is Carmen Best is the chief of police. She has over 30 years experience in that department, and she has huge experience working with the community over those 30 years. No one in council has sat down with her or talked to her about what cuts are appropriate, what she needs, how we continue the level of services. We know that people want to we all want to reimagine policing. But at the same time, we want to make sure that when there is an emergency, it can be responded to. And we've seen those emergencies over the last 4 weeks. We had an arson in a hotel on Aurora where 2 people died. Fire and police had to respond immediately. We've had shootings in multiple places in the city that the police department has had to respond to and investigate. Those things continue to happen. So we know that there still needs to be the ability to have police respond to emergencies and fire to respond to emergencies. So yes, we need more community-based interventions, but you cannot build that overnight, and you can't cut the response that people need in the city.
Okay, we only have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, actually, I was about to say, Chris, this has to be the last question because we've got to get Mayor off for a press conference.
Okay. So the other issue occurring today is another hearing over the subpoena by Seattle Police to 5 different local media organizations. You and I talked about this last week. The city attorney's office has given a statement saying you have the ability to get involved in this discussion since the police department answers to you. Where have those discussions gone between you and the chief? I know you said you wanted to talk to the chief. Is there any potential movement from your side about that subpoena of the local organizations?
So first, as you know, Chris, elected officials don't get involved in individual criminal cases. And as mayor, I've never once reviewed a search warrant or subpoena in a criminal case. We've seen what happens at the national level when that happens with President Trump. The chief, as I understand it, the judge and the chief and the city yesterday appealed to the judge that the material should not be turned over to the police. I recognize that not only is there a First Amendment right in terms of unpublished materials, but who should review those? I agree. I don't think government should be the people looking through, even in those cases for a judge to determine that there's a public safety issue because there's a fully automatic suppressed rifle that needs to be found, that I don't believe it should be government that looks through that material, even in those cases where a judge finds it should happen. You need to have that preserved so that both the First Amendment protection that the media has and the First Amendment protections that protesters have is protected to the greatest degree possible.
I don't want to twist your words there, and I know we're short on time, but it sounds like you're saying that you don't believe that police should have the ability to get that video?
No, what I'm saying is that there's multiple issues related to this particular subpoena. And again, as mayor, I don't review individual subpoenas in criminal cases. That judgment has to be made by ultimately the chief of police on what they need for their investigations, but then by a judge to determine whether what they need and the public safety, how to balance those two things. But even in those rare cases where things are subpoenaed, I think we have to have a conversation as to whether we in the city can provide protections greater than the state law allows. As you know, right now, a judge is deciding this issue under the state shield law. I believe there can be greater protections that we offer so that those cases, even in the rare case that the judge determines that should happen, that there's greater protections for the First Amendment than there is perhaps right now in the law.